Um, so first of all, a welcome to this evening's Yad Vashem UK Book Club event. We're privileged to have as our guests Wendy Holden, the best-selling British author of more than 30 books and journalist for 20 years, including a decade at the Daily Telegraph, and survivor Eva Clarke, whose experiences we have read about in Born Survivors, the book we're going to hear a lot more about tonight. Before I hand over to Wendy and Eva, I want to share with you all that Yad Vashem UK will be running an online fundraising campaign on 26th and 27th January in the week of Holocaust Memorial Day. For more information on how you can help, please do email us on events@yadvashem.org.uk or comment in the chat box below. Wendy and Eva, over to you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Simon, and hello everybody. I know there are people from all over the world, so we're very, very pleased to see you all, and thank you for joining us tonight. Eva and I are always very pleased to do these events and to tell the story of Born Survivors. So that's what we're going to be talking about tonight between us in a conversation really that we have. And this is the book, Born Survivors. It has a different cover in America, and in fact it's been published in 22 countries and translated into 16 languages, and there are different covers all over the world, which is always very interesting as for an author to see that. As Simon said, my name is Wendy Holden. I'm an author, I'm an historian, a former journalist and a war correspondent for the Daily Telegraph. My speciality since I left journalism full time to write books is to focus on women in war. And I have had the privilege of writing lots of different books, most of which feature women, remarkable women, very often in war. And I'm very moved by that. I always am looking for the kindness of strangers and finding the humanity in the inhumanity of war. And I've been so lucky to come across some extraordinary stories of courage and compassion. None so much as Born Survivors, however. It is the incredible true story of 3 young mothers who hid their pregnancies from the Nazis and gave birth in the camps. Amazingly, all 3 mothers and all 3 babies managed to survive, and it's their stories that I've been able to tell. Luckily, we are joined by one of those babies. In fact, tonight we're joined by two of those babies, and I'll be introducing you to Hannah later on. But at the moment, she's just taking a back seat and listening to us. So I hope, as we call her our big sister, that we're doing okay. Eva is here also. She will be telling her mother's story, of course. So say hello, Eva.
Hi. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks to me, everybody knows Eva's age, and Hannah's also. Eva was 75 in April. I don't say this to embarrass her, but because within living memory, here is somebody in the flesh whom the Nazis intended to murder and did their utmost to. It's a miracle that she survived. It's a miracle that all 3 babies survived. And I consider it just as much of a miracle that I was able to write about them. And I'm so grateful that they've now named me their honorary sibling, something of which I'm enormously proud. I first came across the story by chance in 2013. I was reading an obituary late at night about a woman who'd been in Auschwitz, who'd had a baby there that had been taken away from her and murdered. And she had died in her 80s and lived with that tragedy her whole life. And it occurred to me that I'd never read anything before about babies who might have survived the Holocaust. And then I thought, well, go figure. They probably didn't. There probably aren't any. And I started to do research online and anywhere that I could, and was staggered to discover that there was nothing written about any babies who had survived. Eventually, my research led me to the name Eva Clarke. And I found her because she works tirelessly for the Holocaust Educational Trust in Britain. I found her through HET, and I asked them to connect us. They did. I went and spent a day with her. And the very great piece of luck that I had, the next piece of luck that I had, was that she lives in Cambridge, England, and I live in Suffolk. So we literally only live an hour and a half apart. When I heard her story originally, I honestly thought that if she lived in Australia, I would have got on a plane to go and meet her, because I was so moved by her and her mother's story. She invited me to her home very graciously. We had a very emotional day together, a lovely day together in lots of ways. We became instant friends. And at the end of the day, I asked her if she would do me the very great honor of letting me write her late mother's story. I'd missed her mother by, I think, 6 months, was it, Eva?
Oh, even less.
Yeah, even less. She died at 96.
Yeah.
In the previous year, so I just missed her sadly. But I asked Eva if it would be possible for me to write her story and her mother's story, and very movingly, she reached out and touched my arm and said, "I've been waiting for you for almost 70 years." I thought she was the only one that had survived that I could find. I had found no other record of them, and I told her that. And she was quite funny about it. She's a little indignant. She said, "Well, I thought I was the only one too, for years and years and years." And then
My mother thought that she was the
exactly,
only one
yes.
too.
And then a few years previously, she'll tell you later, she discovered that there were two other babies whose mothers had been on the same journey from Auschwitz through the slave labor camps to the end of the war, finally to Mauthausen. And they had also had two babies, and those babies had survived, and they were reunited late in life, and that's why I call them siblings of the heart. I met Hannah and Mark, who both live in America, online. And of course, the minute I met them, I fell in love with them too. And I realized that I had to encompass all three stories into one volume that would attempt to chronicle what happened when the Nazis attempted to destroy all the Jews of Europe. It would span the war. It was 3 times the work, 3 times the effort, of course, because I had to chronicle all their stories and travel to every country, all their graves, including one in Tennessee, and to all the key places where they were incarcerated. But once I knew the stories, I had to connect them, and I couldn't leave one of them out. So it was absolutely important to me that I did that. And I think that really is one of the reasons the book has proved to be so successful. We can't identify with 6 million dead, but we can identify with 3 young mothers. And this is the first full account of babies born in the Holocaust who survived, and there's not been a book about babies surviving the Holocaust since, as far as we're aware. So who were these incredible women that I wrote about? Extraordinarily, they were terribly young. They were in their early 20s. Priska, Rachel, and Anka were beautiful, articulate, intelligent women from good families who led busy and happy lives that were full of promise. They were the kind of women I'd have loved to have had as friends. Priska's parents ran a patisserie, a kosher cafe in rural Czechoslovakia, which was very fortunate for her because she loved eating pastries and got to eat all the leftovers. She had a sweet tooth, so she loved that. She was terrific at languages, and she had high hopes of being a teacher and moving to maybe the city, Bratislava, and having a life as a teacher, possibly even a professor. That was her dream. Unfortunately for her, 1939 brought the arrival of the Nazis, and everything changed. As a family, one of the few Jewish families in their area, they decided that they would move to Bratislava, where they might not be quite so obvious. And she did teach as a young woman. She taught secretly Jewish children, and she went to cafes to eat pastries still, because Bratislava actually didn't have too much Nazi oppression to begin with. It was a strange situation there, less oppressive than some other places to begin with. It was there that she met Tibor, her future husband, very handsome journalist, pipe-smoking journalist, very, very good looking, and she fell madly in love. And they met and got married, even under Nazi occupation. They were very, very happy, madly in love, and Priska quite quickly became pregnant. Very sadly for her, she ended up getting pregnant 3 times, and 3 times over the period of a couple of years, she lost all 3 babies. And that was really tragic for them, and they were very upset. But it's even more astonishing to think that it was the 4th baby that survived, even in the most extreme conditions. By the time she was pregnant again, and they were delighted, they ended up celebrating Tibor's birthday and Yom Kippur in Bratislava, and that was the night that the authorities came, the police and the local police and the Nazis, and grabbed them and took them away. and put them onto a cattle wagon and sent them to Auschwitz. They didn't know what Auschwitz was. Nobody knew what Auschwitz was. It was a big secret. On that crowded cattle wagon with people weeping and wailing, they must have been absolutely terrified, and they clung to each other, and they decided that whatever happened, they should name their unborn child. And they decided that if it was a boy, it'd be called Mishka, and if it was a girl, it would be called Hannah. And eventually they arrived in Auschwitz, and the cattle wagon doors were thrown open, and they arrived in what can only be described as hell. Rachel grew up in Pabianice in Poland, a small village, with her parents and 9 siblings. She was the eldest. She had a happy but very busy childhood because her mother was pregnant repeatedly throughout her childhood, and as the eldest daughter, of course, she had to help out. She changed nappies, she made up bottles, she cleaned up the babies, she looked after the babies, and took care of everything so that her mother could get through yet another pregnancy. Quite not surprisingly, perhaps, she decided that she didn't want children. She was going to grow up, she was going to marry somebody rather wonderful, hopefully rich, and live a very nice life and raise money for Zionism, which was very popular at the time. There's a big passion for it, raising money, but war was looming, and they weren't quite sure what was going to happen, and they actually did consider trying to escape before it came. But the man that she met, Monique, who was rich and the son of a widowed woman mill owner, which was unusual, was so devoted to his widowed mother that he refused to leave, so they stayed. The Nazis came, of course, and Poland was sectioned into ghettos, as most areas of occupied Europe were. And they moved from a very nice life and a very nice apartment in Warsaw to ghetto after ghetto after ghetto, and ended up finally in a ghetto called Łódź, where they had starvation conditions. They had to work for minimal food, and no matter how wealthy or educated they'd been previously, they were in with everybody else, and it was all the same for everybody as their money and supplies dwindled. At one point, or towards the end of their time there, they were sharing a room, so all 9 little siblings, and Rachel and her mother and father. Her husband, she had married Monique by then, was working as a fireman within the ghetto, so he wasn't there. And on the day that they were finally rounded up and tricked, actually, into being taken by the Nazis. Up until that point, whenever the Nazis and the local Polish police that worked with them came for people to round them up, to send them on these transports east, that's all they knew, east, they didn't know it was Auschwitz, they would hide and try and get away from being transported because they were terrified of what that meant. And Rachel's father was very enterprising. He built a false wall in this one room that they shared, and he put a large wooden dresser in front of it. I think the Americans would call it a hutch. And in front of it, and it had a hole in the back of it. So as soon as they heard the trucks pulling up and the Nazis arriving and the jackboots on the stairs, he would open the dresser, and the children would climb through the back of the dresser and hide in this little area. And that way they were able to keep themselves safe and together and away from these transports. But eventually, unfortunately, they were tricked, and all of them were rounded up, including all these 9 little children. And they were all put on a train, not with Monique, he wasn't there, and they were also sent to Auschwitz. Eva will now tell you about her family and what happened to them when they were sent to Auschwitz.
My father, Bernd Nathan Nason, and some of his descendants are looking in tonight, I believe. Also, not his direct descendants, but relatives of ours in the States. He was German, and in 1933, he escaped from Germany, realized it was sensible to get out, and he arrived in Prague. He was an architect and interior designer, and when he first arrived in Prague, he managed to get a job working for a man who was a furniture manufacturer. And initially, my father was employed to build film sets at the Barrandov Film Studios, which are still there. My mother was Czech. My mother, Anka, she was Czech, and she was in Prague at that time. She was a law student, and she only managed to do the first year of her law studies because the Nazis invaded and they stopped everybody going to university. My mother came from a small village with an impossible name called Trebekovice pod Orebem, near Hradec Králové, and her father had a small leather factory. And my mother, she met my father quite by chance. They did fall madly in love. It was across a crowded room. One of the many ironies in my story is the fact that in the beginning, my father actually had some commissions to build restaurants and nightclubs for Nazi officers, you know, that, and apparently my mother first saw him in one of these nightclubs. Anyway, they got married on the 15th of May, 1940, which was already under Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia. And initially they were able to live reasonably comfortably. They had the most beautiful apartment at the top of a synagogue in the old town. And my mother said it was very romantic because they had sort of curved windows and they couldn't put any curtains there. And it was very romantic because when there was blackout, they just had candles. Anyway, so as I'm sure most of you, all of you know, what happened when the Germans invaded any country, they imposed the Nuremberg laws upon all Jewish people. And there are hundreds and hundreds of these laws. I will just mention a few, just to give you a few examples. First and foremost, all Jewish people immediately lost their citizenship. They were no longer allowed to vote. Jewish people were immediately thrown out of the professions. They could no longer be doctors, lawyers, teachers. No intermarriage was allowed between Jewish people and those of other faiths. There was a curfew. Jews were not allowed to go out in the evening. They were only allowed to go shopping at certain times of the day, invariably in the late afternoon when there would have been as little fresh produce available as possible. Jewish people were no longer allowed to keep animals. They were no longer allowed to keep their cars or their bicycles. They were no longer allowed to go to parks, swimming pools, theaters, concerts, cinemas. All those things were forbidden. Their lives were meant to be more and more restricted within their own communities. But because none of these restrictions in itself was life-threatening, so shall I tell the story about the cinema?
Sure.
I suppose I've started, I have to finish. So yes, because none of these initially were life-threatening, one day, because my mother was a very, very keen cinema goer, and one day she decided she was going to go to the cinema despite the fact that it was forbidden. She was sitting in the cinema watching the film when the Gestapo came in, the secret police. They came in, they stopped the film, and they started to go through the audience row by row, looking at their ID papers. And my mother was terrified because she had no idea how they would react when they got to her and when they saw the large J for Jew on her papers. And they stopped about halfway through the auditorium, and they stopped and they left the cinema. And they had stopped just one row in front of where my mother had been sitting. And boy, did she breathe a sigh of relief. And she said to me that afterwards, when she got home and told my father where she'd been, he was absolutely furious at the risk that she'd taken. But anyway, she was that sort of person and she did take that sort of risk. So my parents, they, as I said, they were married during occupation and life was getting progressively harder and harder. And at the end of November, the beginning of December of 1941, that is when they were sent to Terezin or Theresienstadt. This was a ghetto, a concentration camp about 40 miles outside of Prague. And the Germans turned this place. It had been a garrison town for Czech soldiers, but the Germans turned this place into a ghetto and a concentration camp. And when I was growing up and I was asking my mother, how she was taken prisoner, because I had various images in my mind. I'd read the Diary of Anne Frank, I'd seen films, I'd seen documentaries. And I had this image of perhaps 3 o'clock in the morning, there would have been soldiers banging on the doors with barking dogs, dragging people out of their beds. And I said to her, that would happen to you? And she said, no, nothing like that. She said, we received a card in the post. And the card said that on a certain day, at a certain time, you would have to report to a warehouse in Prague, near one of the mainland railway stations. And that's what happened. My father received his card first and he left. You were told you could take a small suitcase. You were advised to take warm clothing. You were also advised to take a few pots and pans, which indicated to them that they were going somewhere where they'd be able to cook, they'd be able to look after themselves. And they assumed that they were being sent to some sort of labor camp. And a few days later, my mother received her card and she left. And when families first arrived in Terezin, that is the first time that those families would have been split up. So men were sent to one part, women to another part, elderly people to another part, children to yet another part. They were able to meet up sometimes during the day, but to a large extent they led separate lives. And when my mother arrived in Terezin, she was fortunate enough to be given a job. The job wasn't paid or anything, but life was a bit easier if you had a job. And she had the job of working for the man who had the responsibility for sharing out the food. There wasn't much food there. But what there was, they tried to share out in a fair fashion. And that meant that she had access to food. When I say she had access to food, she would steal. She would steal a potato, a carrot, a turnip, just something with which to make a more substantial soup. And that was literally of vital importance, because at one time my mother had the responsibility every single day for trying to find food for 15 members of her close family. Every single day, that was her main worry. How on earth was she going to find enough food for all those people? And that was quite apart from the greater worry as to what on earth was going to happen to them all in the future. Now, I mentioned the fact that when families first came into Terezin, the sexes were segregated. Well, I have to come to a very important part of my story, you will agree, because it concerns my brother and his conception, me and my conception. The sexes were segregated, but in 1943, my mother discovered that she was actually pregnant. And when I was about, I don't know, 12, 13, no doubt when it would have been at its most embarrassing. Well, I'm sure you'll agree it's embarrassing at any age. I said to her, so how come you got pregnant? And she replied in a very clever way. She said, well, she said, it was very, very, very dangerous. But your father and I got together secretly as and when we could, and to hell with the consequences. End of story. But it was not the end of the story, and it had very, very serious consequences. Because to become pregnant in a concentration camp was considered by the Nazis to be a crime punishable by death. Because they were trying to annihilate, they were trying to murder every single member of the Jewish race. They couldn't prevent women coming into the camps pregnant, but the reason for the segregation was so that they could not become pregnant while there. And when the Nazis discovered that my mother and 4 other women were also pregnant, they made these 5 couples sign a document that said that when the babies were born, they would have to be handed over to be killed. Except they didn't use the word kill, they used the word euthanasia. My mother had never heard the word euthanasia. She had to go and ask somebody what it meant. As I say in schools, if you look it up in a dictionary, it will say something like mercy killing. This would not have been mercy killing, this would have been murder. In the event the other 4 babies were born, we don't actually know what happened to those families. We assume they all perished in Auschwitz. And my brother, Jiří means George, he was born in February of 1944. He was not taken away from my parents, but he actually died of pneumonia 2 months later. And his death meant my life and my mother's life, because had my mother arrived in the Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp, holding my brother in her arms, she would have been sent straight to the gas chamber. But because she arrived in Auschwitz, not holding my brother, and although she was pregnant again, this time with me, nobody knew. She knew, and nobody else knew, and it didn't show because it was very, very early on.
Thank you, Eva. So all 3 women arrived in Auschwitz in various different times in 1944, but all of them were approximately 2 months pregnant when they arrived. Priska, as you've heard, was pregnant for the 4th time by Tibor. She and Tibor were separated on arrival, and apart from one brief glimpse, they never saw each other again. Rachel had been taken with her family and arrived without Monique, who was still in the ghetto. She also never saw him again. And she had never had the chance to tell him that she was 2 months pregnant. Unfortunately for her, very sadly, apart from her immediate sisters, 3 of them who were roughly the same age as her, all the rest of her little siblings and her parents were taken away and sent to the gas chambers. So they were there, they were in the camp, and they were pregnant. A lot of people wonder how people like that could have wanted to get pregnant or risked getting pregnant at a time of Nazi occupation. And it does seem strange. Why would you risk doing that at a time when the Nazis were occupying your country, your city, and you were under daily threat? But as Eva said, they sought comfort where they could, but also you have to put it into perspective in terms of timing. War had started in 1939. This was 1944, and it was coming to an end for huge swathes of Europe. The Allies had come ashore in Normandy, Paris had been liberated, and the Russians were closing in. These people were all young and in love and hopeful, and they believed that it would be over any day. Unfortunately for them, it was far, far from over. So after their epic journeys from the ghettos and occupied cities of Europe, all three women arrived separately between August and October 1944. It was by then Auschwitz II Birkenau was a well-oiled machine, and it was the same experience for them all. I think Anka, Eva's mother, described it as hell on earth. They arrived, the wagon doors were thrown open, there were dogs barking, men shouting, bright lights. Quite often they arrived at night. There were chimneys belching smoke in the distance and a cloying smell that stuck in the back of the throat. They were marched past the furnaces and taken to a room at the back, a place called the sauna, where they were literally stripped of anything that would identify them and had their heads shaved and their bodies, and they were divested of all their belongings and their identity. And then they were marched outside to be inspected and standing naked in the cold, wet clay, keenly feeling the cold on their shaved heads. All the women that had been interviewed by various people and other testimonies from that time that I spoke to, all the women mentioned the shock of the cold on their bald heads. It was just a terrible shock. And Eva, tell us what happened to your mother in those inspections. The two things had happened, I think.
Yeah. Well, first of all, talking about the shaved head, as Wendy says, it came as an enormous shock. And my mother was standing with a very close friend of hers, and neither woman recognized the other. And her friend Mitska was saying, Anka, Anka, where are you? And my mother said, if you are Mitska, I'm standing next to you, because they were totally unrecognizable to one another. The other thing that I would like to tell you about is the fact that, amazingly, my mother still had her engagement ring and her wedding ring on. And it is surprising she got that far, still wearing it. Jews were not allowed to have any gemstones or precious metals. So she had apparently a beautiful, my father had made for her beautiful silver amethyst engagement ring and a silver wedding ring. Anyway, when she saw what was happening, the people were being stripped of absolutely everything. And, you know, it was a very, very uncomfortable feeling for some of them when they were so manhandled and all orifices checked and that sort of thing. So she decided that she wasn't going to let the Nazis have these pieces of jewelry. She thought while it was still within her power, she would get rid of them. And she ground them into the mud with her foot. And when Wendy has been back there, I used to say to her, please keep an eye out for the ring.
In my mind, I always thought I'd find it, you know, and it would be a wonderful thing to bring back to you. But of course, unfortunately, I didn't. And also, Anka actually fainted a couple of times in those roll calls, standing together. And when she did, because she'd seen what had happened, all of them had seen what had happened to women who were very weak or who collapsed, they were literally dragged away from the lines of women that her friends actually held her up by her elbows, even though she'd fainted, until she recovered her senses, because otherwise she might have well been dragged away and taken away. So incredible friendships there. They were all naked, they were all terrified, they were all pregnant, and they all came under the eagle-eyed scrutiny of Dr. Joseph Mengele, the angel of death. Impeccably dressed, he took personal pride in inspecting the new arrivals, even to the point that he would work on his days off because he didn't trust anybody else to inspect, as he called it, the pieces or the stock. He was looking for women who were fit and young and healthy enough to go into slave labor, where largely they were expected to be worked to death. He was also looking for pregnant women because of his experimentation wing on genetics, and he was particularly interested in twins. So he marched up and down these lines of terrified women and asked them, each one, looking straight into their faces with a smile. He had a gap in the middle of his teeth, and he looked them straight in the eye and said, "Are you pregnant, pretty woman?" And each of these three mothers, who did not know at that point whether it might save their unborn children to say that they were, instinctively felt they were in the presence of grave danger, and they each said that they weren't, and that is what saved them. Women who were either very visibly pregnant, or who had little breast milk when he literally squeezed the breast to see if something would betray them, would be taken out of the line and taken away, and nobody knows what happened to those women, but one can only imagine. His means of deciding whether or not somebody was fit for slave labor or not was to flip a pair of gloves. He had a long pair of kid leather gauntlets, and on this occasion, at this period of time, he would flip the gloves left for death and right for life, and those people would be saved and taken away, and those ones will either go to the gas chambers or to the experimentation wing. Some of the survivors that I've seen interviews with spoke of him having a riding crop, but that was the previous year. This year was these very ostentatious riding, almost like motorbike gloves, just so cold and calculating that you could think that that's how you would decide life and death. All three women received the same treatment. They had these interminable roll calls. They're forced to stand naked several times a day, often for hours on end, in biting winds. And they were just in great fear of their lives all the time. But young and healthy, they were all eventually earmarked for work and taken back inside to the sauna, a different room in the sauna, where they were thrown random and completely inappropriate clothing generally. This was taken from a huge pile that had already been stripped from the hapless souls who'd gone to the gas chambers. All three women were so fortunate because they were each given a relatively baggy dress, not that that was to matter towards the end because of their weight loss, but they were also given shoes, and that was so important because that winter proved to be the bitterest winter in European history in 15 years. And if you didn't have shoes, you died. You either died of frostbite, or if you had shoes that were too difficult, too painful, too tight, and created blisters that never healed without any medical care, you would die of sepsis. So it's really important that you got shoes, and you got shoes that fit. So many women were given completely the wrong clothing, and sometimes no shoes, or sometimes children's shoes, and they tried to squeeze their feet into them, or they were given man's boots and they tried to wedge them with newspaper or something, or wooden clogs, anything to help them keep their shoes on when they were trudging back and forth through the snow, as they later were. 1,000 of the women, including all three mothers, were picked for slave labor and sent by train to Freiburg in Germany, where they were imprisoned in a large porcelain factory. It still exists, it's derelict now, and they were forced to work 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. It was incredibly arduous labor, involving using heavy riveting machines to make an aircraft wing for a new jet the Nazis were creating. You can imagine what this must have been like for these women. You know about them now. You know how spoiled they were in many ways, how lovely their lives had been, and they'd never done any work in their lives. And suddenly they're in this situation, which is just so frightening and so horrible. The riveting machines were so heavy, it took two of them to hold them, and it was vibrating. They had no ear defenders, of course. It was just a nasty place to be, and living in fear of being beaten at any time by their guards, and many of them were. They lived chiefly on water, a so-called coffee for breakfast, so-called soup for lunch, with maybe a small piece of black bread or a tiny piece of onion or something they might find in it. And if they were lucky, some coffee, again, ersatz coffee for in the evening. Each of them dropped dramatic amounts of weight and went down to 70 pounds or 5 stone by full term. They slept on hard wooden bunks infested with lice, and every day they had to trudge a mile through snow and ice in the same clothing that they'd been given in Auschwitz all those months before, and could never clean. The women said they couldn't even stand their own smell. They were just felt so dirty. They really thought that they were going to die there. They had little or no help. from anybody outside, and thought that was going to be the end of it. They were just going to get thinner and thinner and weaker, and they and their babies would die. And then in February 1945, a glimmer of hope came, because Dresden was bombed very near to them, 20 miles away, and it lit the sky for miles around. And although it sounds like a terrible thing to think that the death of thousands and thousands of people in the most horrible circumstances in Dresden kind of given them a glimmer of hope in their situation, it did. And Eva, tell us what happened to your mother and the other women when Dresden was bombed.
Right. Well, when Dresden was bombed, so the Germans all, protected themselves in air raid shelters or in the cellars of the factory, and they tried to prevent the prisoners from opening any windows or anything. But apparently, the prisoners opened the windows and were cheering the aircraft because they knew it was the Allies, and they hoped and prayed it wouldn't be too much longer before they were actually rescued. And I'm not sure exactly what you want me to say now. You want me to do the train?
Well, that was it. That they would rather be.
They
would rather
yeah,
have died
they
at the
would,
hands of
yeah,
the Allies.
yeah, they would rather. Yeah, my mother said they all wished that the bombs could fall on them, so they really couldn't have cared less. They just wished that the bombs would fall on them, and that it would all stop. But of course, it didn't.
Even after Dresden, of course, there was no respite, and many were dead and dying. And some women, other women within that group who were discovered pregnant were actually sent back to Auschwitz, where they were treated most cruelly by Dr. Mengele. So it was incredibly important to keep it secret. Rachel, for example, who was with her three sisters who shared her bunk with her, they did not know she was pregnant. That's how important it was. Vital to keep it secret. She daren't compromise them by telling them, and nobody must know. And it must have been such a terribly frightening thing for them, because it was their secret. They had these tiny infants inside them. They didn't show very much because they were so thin, but they knew that the inevitable would happen, and that one day the pregnancy would be revealed by giving birth. And that must have been the most terrifying idea to their minds as their due dates became closer and closer. Priska was the first to go into labour on April the 12th, 1945. She went into labour, and after hiding her pregnancy for 7 months under that baggy dress, the Nazis took birth on whether it be a boy or a girl, as she gave birth on a plank in the factory. And little sickly Hannah, weighing only just 3 pounds, came out with her fists at her ears, and I always think that was to defend them from the noise of the factory. Priska probably expected Hannah to be taken away from her, and as other babies had been, and as other pregnant women had been. But that didn't happen, strangely, and the reason it didn't happen was because the commandant knew that there was no more work to be done at the factory, there were no more parts, and that he had to eradicate the evidence as the Russians and the Allies grew closer. So the following day, the surviving women from that factory, including Priska with tiny baby Hannah, Rachel heavily pregnant with her baby, and Anka pregnant with Eva, were loaded onto a train with the surviving prisoners. I think there were 900 left by then. Destination Buchenwald, which was 2 days train ride away to an inevitable end. The Russians and Americans were closing in, but Buchenwald, of course, and wonderfully, was liberated the following day. And so the 2-day train journey without hardly any food or water, if any food or water, then went on for 17 days, as the commandant insisted that the train driver keep snaking the train further and further south, looking for a concentration camp that was still open, not been liberated, and was big enough to take these prisoners and eradicate them. Along the way, other carriages and wagons of concentration camp victims were tagged onto the end of it. So by the end of it, this snaking train of death had something like 3,000 dead and dying prisoners heading for they did not know where. On April the 20th, Rachel, who was in a wagon with her sisters, gave birth. It was a coal wagon, an open coal wagon full of dying women. She was absolutely filthy, and she gave birth to a little tiny baby Mark, also weighing about 3 pounds, in a deluge. Her sisters, who didn't know she was pregnant, burst into tears because they absolutely believed that mother and baby would not survive the night. It was a most dreadful situation for her because she was extremely poorly, and all she wanted was to name her child. She named him Mark, and she also wanted to know the date of the birth, and it was April the 20th. It was Hitler's birthday, and the only reason everybody on the train knew that was because of Hitler's birthday. All the swastikas were out everywhere, and they were aware that that was the date. So she wanted it to be noted that her son was called Mark and was born on April 20th. Due to bombing of the tracks by the Allies, further ahead, the train was unexpectedly stopped for 2 days at a tiny little town called Horní Brýže in Czechoslovakia. And what happened here saved them all. It was the most extraordinary thing. They really were so lucky that that had happened. It was the biggest piece of luck they had, because the train station master, a man called Antonin Pavlicek, who had never seen anything like this in his life before, when he saw this train come into his station, that was then his responsibility, the wagon doors opened. He couldn't tell if they were men or women. He thought they had been animals from the noises and the smell, and he couldn't believe that they were humans. 39 bodies were thrown off like so much rubbish and just discarded in the woods, and Mr. Pavlicek wasn't having this. He completely confronted the commandant time and again at great risk to his own life, demanded that the bodies be buried, demanded that names be given, and finally he rallied the compassionate townspeople who came to the factory, the big factory there, and overnight they baked 3,000 small bread rolls, and they made huge pots of potato soup. And Mr. Pavlicek insisted that the wagons be disgorged one by one, and that the townspeople give these people the food, because it was so important that they get something. It was the most amazing thing that he did, and because the train was so long, not everybody got anything, and Eva will now tell you what happened to Anka in that town.
Also, just a postscript to what Wendy was saying about the bread rolls, some people had put messages in them, and the messages said, "Hang on, it's almost over, just hang on in there." My mother was probably on one of the last coal wagons, because she always thought that the train stopped in the middle of the countryside. She had no idea it had stopped in a small town, at a small station. And so, unfortunately, she didn't get any of the bread rolls or the potato soup. But what she did get was a glass of milk, because a farmer walked by and saw her and was so shocked when he saw her. She described herself as looking like a scarcely living pregnant skeleton. As Wendy has already mentioned, all these women weighed not more than 5 stone each, 70 pounds. And this farmer had such a shock, he brought my mother a glass of milk. But there was a Nazi officer standing near her, and he had a whip. And he raised this whip to shoulder height as if to beat my mother if she accepted the glass of milk. But he didn't. He didn't say anything. He lowered his arm and he let her have the glass of milk. She maintained that saved her life. Who knows? Perhaps it did. And I have to tell you, she loathed milk before and afterwards, but she liked that glass of milk. And the train went on, and it eventually arrived in this place called Mauthausen. Mauthausen itself was a beautiful village on the banks of the Danube in Austria near Linz. The concentration camp was up the very, very steep hill behind the village. And when my mother saw the name Mauthausen at the station, she had such a shock, because as opposed to when she'd arrived in Auschwitz, not knowing what that was, this time she knew, because she had heard about this appalling place from very early on in the war. And she always thought that the shock possibly provoked the onset of her labor. And she started to give birth to me on that coal wagon. She had to climb off the coal wagon unaided. She had to climb onto a cart, because the prisoners who were not strong enough to walk up the steep hill, they had to get onto carts and they were pulled up by others. She had people lying all over her, people with typhus and typhoid fever. And she proceeded to give birth to me. And there was another Nazi officer who saw that she was in the midst of child labor. And he said to her, "Du kannst weiter schreien," which means you can carry on screaming, because presumably she had been. And she always said that she was screaming, not only because she was in labor, but because she thought this was her very last minute on this earth. She thought she was about to die. but we both survived the experience. I was born, I didn't move, I didn't breathe. Incredibly, the Germans allowed a doctor to come to my mother, a doctor who was also a prisoner. And presumably they allowed it because they could hear the guns in the distance. And the doctor came and he cut the umbilical cord and he smacked me to make me cry, to make me breathe. And there are 3 reasons why we survived. And the first is a very chilling one. On the 28th of April, 1945, the Nazis had run out of gas to the gas chamber. My birthday is the 29th. So presumably, had the train arrived there on the 26th or 27th, wouldn't be here today. The second indirect reason why we survived was because on the 30th of April, Hitler committed suicide. And the last and the best reason why we survived was because on the 5th of May, the American army liberated the camp. My mother reckoned she wouldn't have lasted much longer. They think I weighed, like the other 2 babies, about 3 pounds. A 3-pound baby nowadays put straight into an incubator. There were no incubators. Or I always say, perhaps I had the best incubator and the other 2 mothers as well, because we were just held all the time.
Thank you, Eva. Now you know why they're called the miracle babies. I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary that they lived, they survived infection, malnourishment, the constant risk of discovery, disease, typhus. It was incredible. And all 3 mothers, and most of the people that I've spoken to that are related to this story or have been involved in the story or were there, would say that it was down to luck more than anything else, just the luck of timing quite often. And it was an amazing thing. But of course, the war wasn't over for them. They may have survived, but thousands died just from being given food by the Americans. And that was a great tragedy, although we like to think that they died at least knowing that they were free. All 3 women had to regain their strength. They had to take care for their babies, and eventually they were allowed to leave Mauthausen and return home, where they discovered that they had lost everything they owned, most of their families, and all 3 husbands to the Nazis. Tibor, Priska's husband, perished on the death march out of Auschwitz. Friends told Priska that they thought he'd given up because he believed he'd lost his wife and baby, and he collapsed in the snow where he was possibly shot. Monique, Rachel's husband, who never even knew she was pregnant, and he had a son, Mark, was rounded up in the Lodz ghetto after they had gone, and he was shot there. And Eva, your father Bernd, I think, was killed on the same death march out of Auschwitz as Tibor on the 18th of January 1945, which was just 9 days before that camp was liberated. Incredibly, despite having lost everything and owning nothing, these women refused to give up. They had 3 new human beings to bring into this world, a world that must have seemed hopeless to them, but they insisted that not only would they raise them to be fit and well and healthy, but they would raise them not to harbor bitterness in their hearts, and none of them do. They are extraordinary, life-enhancing people, and they have each gone on to do remarkable, remarkable things. Mark is a doctor in Wisconsin, and he trains ER doctors, and he does a lot of pro bono charity work. Hannah, who is listening to this and we'll say hello to in a minute, has been a chemist and done wonderful things her whole life, testing drugs predominantly, which I always thought was a wonderful, delicious irony, because she was one of the first ever civilians to be saved by penicillin when she was an infant. And Eva, as I told you, has been in education her whole life, and in retirement, and I call it retirement jokingly, works tirelessly for the Holocaust Educational Trust. These babies have all produced children and grandchildren for the 3 women who survived all of this, and they have gone on to enhance the world in ways we couldn't have imagined. They are what I call the voices of the voiceless, and because of their ages, in 5-10 years' time, they will be the last voices to be silenced. They will literally be the last living survivors on this planet. And they are here still now to celebrate their late mothers' courage and defiance, and affirm the human capacity to hope and to love. Thank you very much indeed for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Wendy. You always do the bulk of the work.
And Hannah, would you just come in and say hello to everybody now and give us a wave?
First of all, thank you. Thank you for having happening and hearing Wendy, our youngest sister. I'm the oldest, and I never forget to mention it to everybody. They have to listen to me. Yeah, right. I am so lucky. And as my mom used to say, she never felt sorry for herself. She never remarried because there was nobody like my dad, Tibor. She also went on finishing her PhD about a year before I did. And she made that very clear that she's doing it in languages. She was a wonderful teacher, much loved by her students. She was even my teacher of English, and it wasn't easy. But above all, what she kept repeating to me, don't feel bad, we are here. I brought you home. I was convinced I will have you, and I brought you home. And so that's how I was raised. And yes, I grew up in a socialist country, and yes, I couldn't really be proud that I am Jewish and a survivor. Actually, it was kind of working against me, but it didn't matter. I was able to leave in 68, being pregnant with my son and hearing the guns. I said to my husband, my Tommy's father, there's no way I'm going to stay here. And the rest is history. I left in 68. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Can I just interrupt something? Hannah, at least I'm going to introduce you virtually to my cousin Vera Jelinek, who was a hidden child in Slovakia. And I'll give you contact details afterwards.
Please, please. I will be in Brooklyn next year. You know, we don't say next year in Jerusalem. Now we say next year where we can go. And I'll go to Brooklyn, Vera, and I will look you up.
Thank you very much. I think
thank you.
Has any questions, Simon? Are there any questions, or do we have some time for questions? How are we doing?
Yes, I was muted.
Trying to get in touch with me.
Ruth, are you there? You're so kind, because I think it's the crack of dawn in Sydney and you've got up early, especially to watch this. I do thank you.
It was wonderful. It was just like the book with a few additional anecdotes. Beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So, Simon, sorry.
I don't think we have any questions.
No, I thought we might stun people into silence.
Well, you have. You've been sensational. So if there are no questions, then it's for me to say a huge thank you to you, Wendy, and to you, Eva, for sharing this intense, powerful and moving account and experience, Frank, so movingly with us. So, and thank you to all that have joined us tonight. I mentioned in my introduction that for those of you who'd like more information on how you can be part of our 2-day fundraising event, to please email us at events@yadvashem.org.uk or comment in the chat box. On the assumption there are no questions, just a final very, very big thank you very much.
I have one question.
One question, over to you.
So this isn't a question, and it's really very irrelevant and not, but I just like to tell people that I share the same birthday with Eva, and we at one of her talks, and I feel proud to have the same birthday. I've got 10 years after hers, but my birthday is April the 29th, and when I always think of Eva on my birthday.
Denise. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Caroline, you have a question.
Hi, Eva. Hi, Wendy.
Hi.
I read a lot of Holocaust books. Since I went to Israel, I promised myself that I was never going to leave before I went to Yad Vashem, and since then I can't read enough. So your book is amazing, and it's an amazing concept of thought of these women, because there's so many questions that we have about the war and the Holocaust, where they're not even asked, they're not even told. So this is an amazing thing. I just wanted to ask Eva, are you as determined and a risk taker like your dear mother was?
I very much doubt it. I'm always amazed when I think about what she went through. I think I would have I would have crumbled at the first hurdle. I really do. I don't think I could have done it.
Well, the thing about courage is, I speak a lot about courage to people, and the thing about courage is that you just don't know that you have it until you're called upon to use it.
Yeah.
And I suspect that Eva has a rod of steel through her, like Anchor, and I think that's true for all of my babies, as I call them.
Oh, lovely. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.
Laurie,
I just my husband's grandmother and Eva's grandmother were sisters, and our family did not even know that Eva was born or existed or anybody survived until what, 20 years ago maybe.
Yeah.
And we're so grateful that we discovered her, because she's been a very important part of our lives since then.
And the feeling's mutual, Laurie. and I think at least I will probably apologize to Wendy afterwards that I haven't been as fluent as I'd like to think I usually am. And I think it's because there's so many members of my family on the screen.
Well, we're blessed to be a part of this important program, and blessed to be related to you. Thank you.
Can
I just make one or two comments?
Of course.
Sure.
Okay, so I'm Vera Jelinek. I'm proud to be Eva's cousin, twice or three times removed through Pepe. But we hail from the same country. Hannah, I think you and I are both from Slovakia originally.
Yes, we are.
I look forward to speaking with you.
Me too.
I'd like to know that in recent months, I've been contacted by I'm a historian by training, but I'm not practicing that now. I'm at NYU. Because there's been a renewed interest in what happened to the Jews of Slovakia and in other areas. And I find that very heartening because, as you well know, Slovakia under Father Tiso was very much of a fascist country that actually paid Hitler for every Jew he deported. So this renewed interest that is now starting, and I've been in correspondence with two of them by email. That was one. And the other thing that sort of struck me when Eva mentioned the importance of shoes, which my father always talked about because he was for a bit in Sobibor when my mother died. But he said, they would get outside shoes, and of course that would cripple them when they had to go in the snow. But I don't know if any of you read Levy's book, and he did a movie, a video, when he went back to Auschwitz with some reporters from Italy, subsequently committed suicide. But he went back and he said that in Auschwitz, forgive my Italian, which is now rusty, si moriva di scarpe, which is the reflexive of one died of shoes, right? Mm-hmm. Exactly what Eva was talking about.
Yeah.
It was so important. It was so important. And,
was it Wendy who said it? Sorry.
It makes me so humble in the whole process of writing this book and writing other books about the Holocaust. Makes me so incredibly humble. I mean, if ever you're tired or your shoes pinch even the slightest bit, you think, for goodness sake, don't even think about complaining. Don't even let it enter your head in 1 minute, because we know nothing. We're so blessed, and no, it's extraordinary, and it's extraordinary that they were able to survive it. But as I said, to survive it and not only remain positive, useful, wonderful people, but to instill that in their children. When Mark was growing up and he discovered what had happened to his family, he was growing up in Israel. He told his mother that he was going to get a gun and shoot every German he'd ever could meet, and his mother was furious. She said, no, you don't understand. If you speak like that, then they took everything from us, but if you speak like that, they will also have taken your soul. And it was a wonderful message, and that's really been the message of all the mothers. They've been absolutely amazing and wonderful women. And we're so blessed to be, I feel so blessed to have been able to chronicle their stories for the world.
And also Wendy, she has in a sense met our mothers, because Wendy looked at all the Shoah Foundation testimonies, and all three mothers had made those testimonies. And so you did get an idea of them. But I'm convinced, and I'm sure Hannah and Mark would agree, that all the mothers would have fallen in love with you too.
Totally. Totally.
Totally. Yeah, exactly.
Thank you so much. Bless you all. I'm going to
Thank
leave
you.
now, but thank you so much, and we'll see you again, hopefully.
Okay.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful.
Stay safe.
Wonderful.
Stay safe.
Everybody safe, exactly.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Right.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Amazing.